You wake up in a medieval ditch, which is really not the best place to start your day, especially when the ditch smells like wet sheep, spoiled ale, and something you're not entirely sure isn't human. The grass is damp, your wool tunic is soaked through, and your helmet, it's not even yours, is wedged at an angle that feels like it's trying to divorce your skull. You're a soldier. Sort of. More accurately, you're someone who was promised half a chicken and a loaf of bread to climb a wall and possibly die. But don't worry. It's not personal. Nobody here is special. You're one of 100 poor souls drafted by a local baron who thought, yes, ladders. Definitely the most dignified way to breach a fortress. And so here you are, lying in mud, listening to the rhythmic clanging of armor, grunts of men with dental hygiene that could qualify as chemical warfare, and the distant shouting of someone probably regretting their life choices midair. And before we get too cozy, do me one small favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're into sarcastic, soothing historical deep dives. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Are you in bed, on the bus, or hiding from responsibilities in your closet? It's oddly comforting to know where the Insomnia Club is checking in from. Anyway, back to ladders. The ladder. A tool so profoundly boring, it rarely gets the credit it deserves. In your modern life, it's just a clunky metal thing that wobbles dramatically every time you try to change a light bulb. But in medieval warfare, it was an instrument of chaos, a symbol of desperation, a glorified stick with rungs that dared peasants to defy gravity, flaming pitch, and arrows, all for the honor of dying slightly higher up than usual. Let's begin with the basics. In case you've never besieged a castle, because, you know, modern zoning laws make that tricky, let's paint the picture. You're standing at the base of a stone wall. It's tall. It's menacing. It was built by people who hated you specifically, or at least hated the concept of visitors. There are archers at the top, watching you like you're the entertainment for today's execution-themed matinee. You're holding a wooden ladder, handcrafted by someone who had zero plans to actually climb it themselves. Probably a carpenter named Ealdwine who lives a nice quiet life far away from arrow fire and the smell of burning flesh. You and your squad, mostly made up of terrified farmers with pointy sticks, are ordered to run toward the wall. Fast. Try not to die. Get the ladder up. Climb. Don't look down. Don't scream too loudly when a rock the size of your head kisses you goodnight. Now, let's stop for a second and appreciate how dumb this is. Because medieval military logic was often just a few breadcrumbs short of a meat pie. Imagine sitting in a smoky tavern after the war, holding a tankard of watered-down ale, and telling someone, oh yeah, we attacked the fortress by leaning a tree trunk against it and playing medieval human Tetris up the side. And yet, it worked. Sometimes. Because in an era before helicopters, C4, or even decent shoes, ladders were what you had. Sure, there were siege towers, battering rams, and trebuchets, but all of those required time, resources, and, most importantly, carpenters who didn't mysteriously vanish every time a war started. Ladders were fast, portable, deadly, mostly to the people using them. But let's rewind. Because the use of ladders in warfare isn't just a medieval blip on the historical radar. Oh no. These awkward wooden death escalators have a long, traumatic lineage. Let's time travel a bit, shall we? Ancient Mesopotamians? Ladders. Assyrians? Ladders, and a deeply concerning enthusiasm for flaying people afterward. Romans? Absolutely. Except the Romans like to make it theatrical. Picture it, Roman soldiers marching in formation, setting up siege ladders against a Gallic hill fort while wearing sandals, skirts, and expressions of polite disinterest. The Romans were efficient, brutal, and probably very sore after hauling a 20-foot ladder up a rocky incline while being pelted with flaming cow dung. And yet, even with all the historical baggage, the ladder stuck around. Because nothing says we've run out of ideas like leaning a glorified fence post against a fortress and hoping for the best. Now, let's talk about design. You might think it's a ladder. What's there to design? Oh, sweet innocent listener. The ideal siege ladder had to be long enough to reach the top of a fortress wall, usually 20 to 40 feet high. But not too long, or it would become too heavy to lift and might collapse under its own misery. It had to be wide enough to let a soldier climb with a shield and weapon, but narrow enough that it could be carried by two unlucky saps and leaned against a wall without snapping in half. Ideally, the rungs wouldn't break mid-climb. But that was more of a bonus feature than a guarantee. Also, there were no safety standards. No inspections. No OSHA. If a rung snapped and you broke your leg, the army doctor would probably diagnose it as God's punishment for cowardice and prescribe leeches. And you couldn't just lean the ladder and call it a day. No. Timing mattered. You needed a team to carry the ladder under enemy fire. Archers behind you had to cover your advance. And if you actually made it to the wall, you had to climb. Fast. With 40 pounds of armor. And maybe an axe. While being stabbed from above with spears by defenders who definitely did not want you crashing their stone penthouse. Oh, and boiling oil. Let's not forget the boiling oil. Okay, confession time. Boiling oil wasn't actually as common as people think. Mostly because oil was expensive, and even medieval warlords didn't want to waste perfectly good cooking supplies on invaders. More often, it was boiling water, sand, or quicklime. Just imagine climbing a ladder while someone dumps a pot of scorching liquid misery on your head. The best case scenario? You let go and fall to your death. The worst case? You keep climbing, permanently blind and very, very angry. But hey, at least you're not on fire. Except, sometimes you are on fire. Because defenders had a nasty habit of setting ladders ablaze. Which brings us to the classic tactical moment known as "why is the ladder smoking?" followed by "oh no, that's my leg." So, to summarize, you're climbing a flimsy wooden stick under missile fire, while wearing chainmail, trying to avoid becoming a flaming human kebab, all to reach a place where people are waiting to murder you with pointy things. Sleepy yet? Let's shift perspective for a moment. Imagine you're inside the castle. You wake up in your stone tower, pull on your itchy wool robe, and step out onto the parapet. There's fog on the hills, the scent of mold and damp straw in the air, and the soothing sound of dozens of people outside screaming and dying. Lovely. You peer over the wall. Oh good. It's another ladder assault. You grab your spear, yawn, and begin stabbing downward at the nearest invader's hand. One finger at a time. From your vantage point, it's honestly kind of relaxing. Like a very violent game of whack-a-mole. And you know that, statistically, most of the people climbing those ladders aren't going to make it more than halfway. The ones who do, well, you have a lovely surprise party waiting at the top. Swords, arrows, maybe a stray goat. Let's not forget, defenders had the advantage. Higher ground, strong walls, more weapons, and a smug sense of architectural superiority. So why did attackers even bother with ladders? Because sometimes they worked. When morale was high, coordination was decent, and nobody dropped the ladder halfway across the battlefield, you could overrun a wall. If enough people climbed at once, the defenders could be overwhelmed. Some ladders even had hooks at the top, so they could latch onto battlements like awkward grappling hugs. And in some legendary cases, like the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, ladders helped breach holy cities. Sure, most of the people climbing them died horribly, but, progress. Medieval warfare wasn't elegant. It wasn't clever. It was mostly mud, blood, and a lot of yelling. The ladder, humble as it was, became a weird, suicidal symbol of grit. Because when you saw a ladder going up, you knew someone had decided, screw it. I'd rather die trying than keep eating turnip stew and sleeping next to Jeff, who hasn't bathed since Epiphany. And you? You're still in the mud. Still waiting for your turn. Your hands are shaking. Your armor is rusted. The guy next to you is muttering a prayer that sounds suspiciously like a list of regrets. You lift the ladder. The horn sounds. Time to climb. But don't worry. We've got several hours more of medieval discomfort to unpack. Ladders were just the beginning. Next, we'll talk about how siege engineers tried to make these things less awful. Or at least more flammable. So lie back, close your eyes, and imagine the gentle creak of wood, the distant screams of your comrades, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, you'll make it to the top. Spoiler, you won't. You're halfway up the ladder now. Not that you meant to get this far. In fact, the plan was to climb maybe 3 rungs, pretend to slip, fall with a convincing scream, and roll dramatically into the nearest bush. But fate, or maybe just the enormous angry man behind you yelling, "Climb, you coward," had other plans. Your hands are blistered. Your legs ache. Your nose is full of the aroma of sweat, burning pitch, and whatever that weird sour smell is that follows medieval armies around like an unwelcome ghost. Below you, someone has thrown up. Above you, someone is screaming. But you're just trying to remember why you ever agreed to this. Ah yes, bread. Bread and the vague promise of loot, which so far has turned out to be a dead man's glove and an arrow through your friend's thigh. And still, the ladder creaks beneath you. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of your situation. Because this, dear sleeper, is what military strategy looked like before drones, tanks, or even functional shoes. You are climbing a glorified fence plank while someone in a helmet that looks like an upside-down bucket tries to poke your eyeballs out with a 6-foot spear. Romantic, isn't it? But believe it or not, there was strategy involved in this madness. Sort of. Let's break down how the use of ladders actually functioned in a larger military campaign. Yes, there was yelling, blood, and panic, but there was also planning. Kind of. See, you couldn't just run at a castle willy-nilly with ladders and dreams. First, you needed reconnaissance. Scouts, usually unpaid, unwashed, and deeply underappreciated, were sent to estimate wall height, enemy strength, terrain slope, and potential ladder spots. If you're picturing someone sneaking around in the bushes with a tape measure and a notebook, don't. This is medieval Europe. The scout is probably hiding in a dung heap and guessing wall height based on the time it takes for a thrown rock to hit the ground. Once the walls were measured, give or take several feet, the siege commander had to make a decision. Ladders, siege towers, tunneling, bribery, or the old-fashioned wait until everyone inside starves and dies. Ladders were usually the cheapest and most desperate option. Quick to make, easy to transport, high mortality rate, sure, but they didn't eat much and could be built in a day by a few carpenters and some very nervous conscripts. But here's where it gets fun. Not all ladder assaults were meant to succeed. Sometimes, ladders were just distractions. You send in a wave of screaming maniacs up rickety ladders while your real team, usually a few sneaky types with ropes and grappling hooks, is climbing the less defended side of the fortress. Or while sappers are busy trying to tunnel under the wall. Or while you light the stables on fire and hope the defenders get distracted by the smell of flaming horse. Yes, flaming horse. That's a real thing. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where everything is on fire and nothing makes sense. In these distraction-based ladder assaults, your job is basically to look threatening, shout things like "for the king," and die loudly enough to draw attention. You're the fireworks display before the real attack, the pre-show entertainment, the cannon fodder. And again, let's emphasize, you volunteered for this. Or, more likely, were volunteered. Perhaps your village owed taxes. Perhaps you stole something. Perhaps you were just standing too close when a knight said, "You there, with the legs. You look climbable." And so here you are, being flammable. Now, let's pause and consider the construction of these ladders. Because as much as we joke, the engineering involved was, surprisingly, not terrible. Siege ladders were often reinforced with metal bindings, sometimes greased to make them harder to set alight, and occasionally painted with, well, whatever foul-smelling goop was available to make them resistant to the elements, which usually just made them more unpleasant to hold. Some even had hooks at the top, great iron claws designed to latch onto battlements and keep the ladder from sliding. In theory. In practice, those hooks often got tangled, fell off, or embedded into something soft and human. Let's also not forget the angle. Too steep? You fall backward and land in a bush shaped like regret. Too shallow? The ladder slides out and you become a cautionary tale. The perfect angle was about 75 degrees. A detail no one cared about, because the guy doing the climbing was too busy praying to 6 different saints simultaneously. Which brings us to another glorious part of the ladder experience, religion. Because you weren't just climbing with your limbs. You were climbing with faith. Every army had its chaplains, monks, or random bearded men screaming scripture near the tents. Before a ladder assault, there were prayers, blessings, sometimes even holy relics carried into battle, like the finger bone of Saint Agatha or a splinter of the true cross, presumably to encourage divine intervention or at least some polite divine pity. "May the Lord protect you," the priest says, handing you a wooden cross. "May the Lord also protect my knees," You reply, clutching the ladder like it's your mother's hand on your first day of school. A school full of knives and airborne rocks. It didn't help that defenders hated ladder assaults. Not just because they were dangerous, but because they were messy. There's a particular chaos to having 20 screaming men try to scramble over your wall like drunken squirrels with swords. It wasn't just about keeping them off, it was about pushing them back down. Hence the endless supply of rocks, hot liquids, burning hay, and angry livestock occasionally thrown over the edge. Yes, sometimes even livestock. Because in times of siege, logic goes out the window, and someone always says, "What if we dropped a pig on them?" It was medieval problem-solving at its finest. And now, we return to you. You're nearing the top of the ladder. The wall is just a few feet above. You can see the hands of the defenders gripping the ledge, preparing to shove you back. You hear shouting, your name, maybe, or a warning. Something about incoming. You don't care. Your focus is on planting one foot after another, clinging to the wood, ignoring the pain in your shoulders, the sweat in your eyes, the growing awareness that this is almost definitely the worst decision of your life. Then the ladder wobbles. Something hits it, maybe a rock, maybe a body, and you sway. You grip tight. You scream something incoherent about injustice and sore ankles. And just as you reach up, just as your hand brushes the stone, you fall. Back down. Through the air. Past your comrades. Past a guy trying to climb up who looks way too enthusiastic about this. And you land, with a thud, in the mud. Flat on your back. Alive. Your leg is probably broken. Your pride is absolutely shattered. And your commanding officer is yelling something about try again. Because here's the thing. Ladder assaults weren't one-time events. Oh no. You didn't get to fail and go home. You got to reset. Like some grim medieval video game where you respawn in the mud and do it all again. Pick up the ladder. Try again. Maybe this time you'll make it. Maybe this time the defenders will be tired. Or drunk. Or distracted by a nearby trebuchet hurling a dead horse. Maybe you'll die. Or maybe you'll get over that wall and become a hero. For about 12 minutes, before you're stabbed by a guy named Bertram who's been waiting behind the parapet with a halberd and a grudge. So you lie there, in the mud, listening to the chaos around you. Your body hurts. Your ears ring. A pigeon lands on your chest, looks at you with disdain, and leaves. This is ladder warfare. Grimy, brutal, a little bit stupid, but absolutely real. And we're not even halfway done. Yes, that happened. So close your eyes. Imagine 100 men, grunting and groaning, carrying a 20-foot ladder across a battlefield while being pelted with sewage and medieval swear words. Imagine the creak of wood, the whistle of arrows, the occasional triumphant scream of someone who made it to the top, and the inevitable thud when they didn't stay there. We'll be here a while. You wake up face down in the mud again. Not by choice, of course. You didn't exactly ask to be here. On your back, on the battlefield, covered in someone else's blood, probably, with a ladder splinter lodged in your thigh and a beetle crawling across your forehead. The good news? You're not dead yet. The bad news? The ladder crew is assembling again. Because apparently, medieval armies had no concept of taking the hint. No one cared that you fell. No one cared that the defenders threw boiling urine on the last group of climbers. And certainly no one cared that it's raining now, which makes the ladder slicker than a bar of soap in a bathhouse brothel. Nope. Orders are orders. And the orders are clear. Get back up that wall. But before we shove you back into the chaos, let's talk about how the humble siege ladder evolved. Because believe it or not, there was a time when someone sat down, likely next to a campfire, chewing on moldy bread, and thought, you know what this needs? Innovation. That's how you end up with things like portable ladders on wheels. Yes, wheels. Because what's more stable and secure than a 20-foot wooden pole tipped with metal hooks? A moving 20-foot wooden pole tipped with metal hooks. Genius. The idea was simple. In theory, you put the ladder on a cart, push it close to the wall under cover of darkness or chaos, and, using some poorly thought-out mechanism like ropes or shouting, hoist the ladder upright and slam it into the wall. In reality, you built a mobile death trap. The wheels got stuck in mud. The ladder collapsed on your own men. The enemy saw you coming from a mile away and poured a pot of burning pitch directly onto your face. But hey, at least you tried. And that's the theme of all medieval siege ladder innovation. They tried. Like the time someone decided to attach a shield to the top of a ladder. Not for climbing under, no. This was for the climber at the very top, who, while desperately clinging to the ladder, would hold up a wooden panel over their head as protection from arrows, rocks, or divine judgment. Of course, balancing a large shield while clinging to a 75-degree vertical plank during enemy fire requires the strength and coordination of an Olympic gymnast. Most soldiers of the day had the strength of an overcooked carrot and the coordination of a drunken goat. So, again, they tried. Let's not forget the foldable ladder. Think of it like a medieval IKEA invention. These were pre-assembled in sections, allowing you to carry the pieces, assemble them near the wall, and voila! Instant vertical doom. Except when someone forgot the bolts. Or the carpenter was drunk. Or someone used pine instead of oak and the whole thing snapped in half like a breadstick. If you're wondering whether siege ladders ever included things like handrails or non-slip rungs, the answer is no. Because apparently, no one in 13th century France ever heard the phrase occupational safety. Speaking of France, let's pause here for a delicious detour into the Battle of Chateau Gallard, 1204. Why? Because it includes one of the rare, successful ladder assaults in medieval history, and it's absolutely ridiculous. King Philip II of France, attempting to wrest Normandy from the English, laid siege to Chateau Gallard, a fortress so smugly well-designed that it made other castles feel insecure. The walls were curved. The towers were thick. It looked like something a child would build in Minecraft on a sugar high. After weeks of starvation tactics and failed assaults, the French engineers had a light bulb moment. Sent climbers up a remote section of the cliff, yes, cliff, beneath the outer wall. They climbed up like medieval rock climbing enthusiasts, dragging ladders with them. Why? Because nothing screams stealth operation like carrying a 30-foot ladder up a cliff face in the rain. And somehow, it worked. The French got into the outer wall, caused chaos, and eventually took the fortress. The lesson here? If your ladder plan sounds stupid, but works, it's still stupid. But it's also now recorded in the annals of military history. Of course, not every ladder operation had such a happy ending. Let's talk about the Siege of Kenilworth, 1266. England. Civil War. Simon de Montfort's rebels holed up in a fortress that was basically a swamp castle, a soggy, miserable stone stronghold surrounded by marshes, wet dreams, and poor decisions. Royalist forces laid siege. They built ladders. They carried them through knee-deep mud. They shouted battle cries like God wills it, and OW my foot. And then they tried to climb. The walls were slick with rain. The defenders had boiling tar, rotting meat, and something that may have once been a sheep but now resembled a jellyfish. The ladders slipped. The men fell. And one unlucky knight got his helmet stuck between two rungs and had to be extracted with a crowbar. The siege lasted 6 months. No one won. Everyone got trench foot. Moral of the story? Sometimes the ladder is not the answer. Sometimes the answer is go home, take a bath, and rethink your life. But ladder warfare didn't stop in the medieval period. Oh no. Like a bad idea that just wouldn't die, siege ladders persisted into the Renaissance and beyond. Let's skip forward to the Siege of Malta, 1565. The Ottoman Empire versus a handful of knights who, depending on who you ask, were either heroes of Christendom or insufferable armored fanatics with a martyr complex. The Ottomans brought siege ladders, hundreds of them. And in a moment of pure, unscripted slapstick, they rushed the walls one morning, only to find that many of the ladders were too short. Short, as in, the engineers miscalculated. You can imagine the chaos, thousands of elite troops, trained for years, staring up at a wall they physically cannot reach. Some tried to jump. Others stacked corpses. A few just stood there, yelling in frustration like kids locked out of a candy shop. It was a disaster. And yet, it happened. Because medieval and early modern warfare wasn't just about glory. It was about miscommunication, bad math, and dying tragically for someone else's ego. Now, let's come back to you. You've been issued a new ladder. This one smells faintly of wet dog and splinters. It's slightly shorter than the last one, which inspires very little confidence. Your captain says something about trying a different angle this time, which is terrifying. You nod, mostly because you're too tired to argue. The rain has stopped. The mud is thicker now. Your boots make sucking sounds with every step. A trumpet blows somewhere in the distance. And just like that, you're off again. Up the wall. Again. This time, maybe you'll make it. This time, maybe the ladder will hold. This time, maybe the defenders are out of rocks. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll get to the top, see what's on the other side of the wall, and realize it was never worth it. Because here's the dark truth behind the glory of siege warfare. Even when you win, it doesn't feel like victory. You've climbed a blood-soaked ladder, lost half your comrades, and reached a courtyard filled with broken furniture, rotting food, and people who now hate you forever. You don't get treasure. You get trauma. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the defenders always fought so hard. Because they knew that the other side of the ladder was just more suffering. But let's not get too dark. You're trying to sleep, after all. So let's end this chapter with a nice, relaxing image. You, in a muddy field, holding a ladder, while someone yells at you in Latin and a goat eats your shoelace. Peaceful, isn't it? You're beginning to think this ladder might be cursed. You're not normally superstitious. You don't flinch when a raven flies overhead. You're pretty sure that black cats are just cats. You only burned that one witch in your village because she gave you food poisoning, totally justified. But now, after falling off your ladder for the 4th time today, after watching 3 other ladders catch fire before they even touch the wall, and after noticing that the same rat keeps appearing at your feet every time you start climbing, you're starting to wonder. It might be cursed. Of course, the real curse here is being born in the 12th century. A time when basic concepts like cover fire or don't run directly into a wall of arrows hadn't quite caught on yet. And so, here you are again, soaked, sore, slightly concussed, and once again tasked with carrying a 30-pound wooden ladder toward a fortress manned by people who really don't want to be friends. But today, you've been promoted. Congratulations. You are now part of the elite siege ladder crew. No, this doesn't mean extra pay. No, you don't get armor. Yes, it's still incredibly likely you'll be on fire by lunch. But the good news? You've been given a special task, ladder placement. This means you're no longer just a warm body flung at the wall like a sack of regrets. You're responsible for carrying, positioning, and stabilizing the ladders so that the real soldiers can climb them, also to their deaths, yes, but with slightly more dignity. Let's talk about that for a moment, the logistics of putting a ladder against a wall in medieval combat. Because it turns out it's a lot harder than it looks. First, you have to carry the ladder across the battlefield. This sounds simple until you remember that the battlefield is not a flat, grassy plain. It's a mud pit full of potholes, arrows, broken weapons, the occasional corpse, and at least one deeply traumatized pig. Now imagine doing that while people are shooting at you. The defenders on the wall are not just waving politely. They are hurling rocks the size of bread loaves. They're launching bolts from crossbows that look like tree trunks. And if they're really in a bad mood, which they usually are, they'll toss boiling water or, yes, again, boiling urine. Let's talk about that for a second. Boiling urine. Historians sometimes politely refer to this as scalding liquid, but we all know what it was. It's free, it's plentiful, and it makes a point. Nothing ends your military aspirations like being hit in the face with a bucket of peasant pea heated to a lively simmer. But I digress. You reach the base of the wall. You slam the ladder into position. And now comes the fun part, keeping it upright. Because ladders don't just magically balance themselves. Especially not when you've got 180 pounds of chainmail-wearing human scaling it while screaming for glory at the top of their lungs. The bottom of the ladder has to be braced. Usually by guys like you, unarmed, barely trained, and absolutely terrified. And then the real madness begins. You watch as your comrades scramble upward. The ladder shakes violently with each movement. From above, you hear arrows thudding into wood. Occasionally, you hear someone shout, "I got one," followed by a horrible scream and the sound of a body hitting the ground. One by one, they climb. One by one, they fall. And you're still holding the ladder, your arms going numb, wondering if this counts as cardio. Eventually, someone at the top gets lucky. They make it over the battlement. You hear the clash of steel, the roar of voices, and then, silence. Maybe they won. Maybe they lost. Maybe they were pushed back down the wall and are currently lying face up in the moat, contemplating their life choices. Either way, it's time for another ladder. Because in ladder warfare, quantity matters. The more ladders you have, the better your odds. Not good odds, just less bad. The idea is to overwhelm the defenders. They can't be everywhere at once. If you bring 50 ladders and they have 20 guys on the wall, statistically someone's getting through. Possibly the guy who forgot to wear pants. But hey, victory is victory. Let's take a quick moment here to remind you, kindly, to like this video and subscribe if your eyes aren't already gently closing. Leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are and what cursed corner of the internet brought you to this battlefield of sleepy despair. It's always oddly heartwarming to see where our global community of sleep-deprived history nerds is tuning in from. Alright, back to the pain. Now let's zoom out a bit. Because ladders weren't just used in traditional sieges. Oh no, they were also used in ambushes. That's right, surprise ladders. Picture it, a castle in the dead of night. Guards asleep, torches flickering in the mist. Suddenly, from the shadows, clack, a ladder is hoisted against the wall. Silent climbers ascend, daggers in hand, hoping to take the fortress without a full battle. Sometimes it worked. The defenders were caught napping, and the gates were open from the inside. Other times, the ladder slipped. Someone sneezed. A dog barked. And suddenly you had 12 men hanging off a wall like angry barnacles, while the defenders dropped stones on their heads and yelled, "You shall not pass." In Latin, obviously. Still, the fact that stealth ladders were a thing tells you just how versatile and desperate medieval siege tactics really were. If it involved climbing and the possibility of injury, someone in a surcoat was going to try it. Now, let's explore one of the weirdest uses of siege ladders in history. Siege of Shenyang, 1267 to 1273. Yes, we're leaving Europe for a moment, because medieval China had ladder warfare, too. But theirs came with a twist. The Mongols, who were very good at war and very bad at taking no for an answer, were trying to take this incredibly well-defended Chinese city. It had massive walls, moats, defenders with terrifying accuracy and very little chill. And so, Kublai Khan's forces tried everything, including the use of giant siege towers with interior ladders. That's right. They built mobile wooden skyscrapers, rolled them up to the wall, and let their troops climb the inside ladders to emerge on the top level, eye level with the defenders. It was like a Trojan horse, but worse. And yet, the defenders still held out. For 6 years. Eventually, the Mongols used Korean engineers to build counterweight trebuchets that could smash the walls to bits. But the ladder tower hybrid remained part of the madness. And the lesson here? Even if your ladder is inside a building on wheels, it's still a ladder. And it still leads to pain. Now, let's swing back to Europe and touch on a particularly cursed innovation, the two-sided ladder. Someone, somewhere, thought, what if we made a ladder that could be climbed from both sides at once? That way, two soldiers could climb simultaneously, faster, right? Except they forgot one small detail, weight. Two men climbing from both sides made the whole thing wobble like a drunk duck on a tightrope. If they weren't perfectly synchronized, and they never were, the ladder twisted, shook, and usually tipped over sideways, spilling everyone off like soggy potatoes. Another brilliant idea, rope ladders thrown by grappling hooks. These were used mostly by pirates and castle ninjas. Yes, they existed. The idea was simple. Toss a hook over the wall, tug to secure it, then climb up the swinging, unstable rope ladder like some kind of medieval Spider-Man. Downside? If the hook slipped, you died. Upside? If you made it, you probably had your own folk song by sunrise. And now, as you sit here, muddy, bruised, and deeply disillusioned, it begins to rain again. Of course it does. Your commanding officer, who has never climbed a ladder in his life, pats your shoulder and says, "You're doing God's work." You briefly consider pushing him up the ladder first, for morale. Instead, you pick up the ladder. Again, your hands are raw. Your boots are waterlogged. You've memorized every knot and grain in the wood. The bottom rung is cracked. The top rung is bloodstained. You know this ladder better than you know your own family. And yet, up you go. Because someone has to do it. And apparently, that someone is always you. Sleep well, brave climber. You wake up coughing. Not because you're ill, Not because you're dying, well, maybe a little of that. No, you wake up coughing because the ladder you're holding, your trusty, splinter-ridden companion of many battles, has just dropped, once again, into a moat. A moat filled with water so green and chunky it has its own microclimate. And since you were underneath it, well, congratulations. You've just had your third full-body ladder baptism this week. It's still dark. The fog is thick, the stars above are barely visible, and the only thing louder than your teeth chattering is the faint whimper of the guy next to you who's convinced he saw a ghost. It was probably just steam rising from the moat. Or a ghost. Honestly, at this point, either is believable. But this is the life you've chosen. Or rather, the life that was chosen for you, by birth, poverty, and the fact that your Lord needed someone who wouldn't be missed. And what are you doing out here in the dark, shivering in wet wool, reeking of swamp and desperation? You're preparing for a night assault. With ladders. Because if climbing a wooden contraption into a murder wall during daylight wasn't already ridiculous enough, someone in command has decided, let's do it in the dark. That way, we'll be harder to see. And yes, it does make sense, for about 17 seconds. Then you remember, the ladders are heavy. The walls are tall. And nobody brought a lantern. Which means you, my noble mosquito-bitten friend, are now expected to run across uneven terrain, in the pitch black, while holding a wooden frame the size of a canoe, and place it gently against a wall, without making noise, while dodging arrows, and possibly ghosts. You'd laugh, but your lungs are full of moat. Let's take a moment to ask, why are ladders so psychologically damaging in medieval warfare? It's not just the splinters, or the bruises, or the third-degree burns from when they're set on fire. No, it's what they represent. A ladder is a symbol of optimism. It's a vertical bridge to glory, to conquest, to what lies beyond. And then it betrays you. Every time. Climbing a siege ladder means watching your comrades fall before you, one by one. It means smelling the blood on each rung as you climb. It means slipping in someone's innards, hearing screams above, and knowing that even if you make it to the top, there's a 92% chance someone is going to introduce your head to a mace. It's hope, weaponized against you. No wonder veterans of siege ladders rarely sleep through the night. They wake up screaming about steps, about heights, about the crunching sound of a ladder being kicked off a parapet while they're still on it. In fact, ladder duty was so dreaded that, in some armies, men volunteered for the front line in open combat just to avoid it. Imagine preferring to charge across an open field into enemy cavalry rather than climb a 6-foot-wide wooden triangle. And yet here you are. Again. Why? Because you, dear sleeper, are a ladderman. There were many like you in history. Poor souls in quilted armor, pushing these oversized chopsticks toward fortress walls while being pelted with the worst humanity had to offer. Sometimes literally. Let's not forget the fine tradition of defensive sewage. Because when the arrows ran out and the boiling liquids weren't ready, defenders had another option: household waste. Buckets of it. Carefully collected over weeks. Sometimes mixed with ash or lime for that extra chemical sting. You haven't truly lived until you've been halfway up a ladder, yelling your war cry, only to have a bucket of fermented filth dumped squarely on your face. Suddenly, you're not screaming for glory, you're just screaming. Trying not to let any of it get into your mouth. Spoiler, it always gets in your mouth. But let's get back to the sensory experience of the ladder itself. Have you ever touched something that somehow feels both dry and slimy? That's what a siege ladder feels like. The wood is old, cracked, soaked in blood, urine, sweat, rain, and something no one has identified yet, but might be ghost juice. The rungs are uneven. One has a suspicious chew mark. Another is slick with lard. Not from enemy sabotage, no, it's just that the cook used the same cart to transport bacon last week. Your gloves don't help. In fact, they make it worse. They're damp, thin, and smell like mold and roasted onion. You wear them anyway, because splinters are not a luxury you can afford. But forget the ladder. Let's talk about your shoes. Or rather, your single surviving boot, and the sad excuse for a sandal you've tied to your other foot using a shredded grain sack. Because here's the thing no one tells you about medieval warfare. It destroys footwear faster than it kills soldiers. You've already stepped in 3 fires, 6 puddles of mystery liquid, and once, horrifyingly, something that moved. And all of this while wearing 50 pounds of borrowed armor that doesn't fit. You look like a tin can assembled by squirrels. The helmet spins when you walk. Your breastplate is too tight. Your chainmail is infested. With what? You don't know. They might be fleas. They might be miniature demons. You've named one of them Gary. He's your closest friend now. The point is, you are a mess. An ambulatory bundle of damp wool, bad decisions, and unprocessed trauma. And yet, you carry that ladder anyway. Because someone must. And the guy next to you is even more concussed than you are. Now let's take a break. A peaceful pause. Breathe. Inhale the fresh, night air. Listen to the crackle of torches along the battlements. Hear the distant cough of someone with a plague. Smell the aroma of wet leather, wood smoke, and existential despair. Now, let's talk religion. Because when you're scaling a medieval wall on a ladder soaked in blood, there's a good chance you're going to find faith real fast. And which saint do you pray to? Traditionally, Saint Michael, patron of soldiers and people with extremely bad ideas. Or perhaps Saint Barbara, for those fearing sudden, violent death, which covers 90% of the medieval population. But laddermen had their own whispered patron, Saint Ulrich of Augsburg, who once reportedly survived a siege by being too stubborn to die. That's the kind of energy you need when you're holding onto a greasy rung 20 feet in the air while someone tries to stab you with a poleaxe. You clutch your amulet. You whisper a prayer. You step onto the first rung. The wood groans. You ignore it. You step again. And again. You're halfway up when the guy below you sneezes so hard he headbutts the ladder, and now your left hand is numb and you've bitten your tongue. Welcome to seat climbing. Now let's pivot to something wildly niche, because you're already here and the sleep is creeping in like a warm fog. Siege ladder tactics in the rain. Oh yes, it's a thing. Rain is usually considered a terrible time to launch a siege. Visibility is low. Morale is lower. The mud is everywhere. But, strangely enough, it's a preferred weather for some commanders. Why? Because fire arrows don't work in rain. Oil won't light. Wooden defenses are soggy. And defenders tend to be miserable and slow. Also, noise. The sound of rain on a helmet drowns out movement. So what do? You double the ladders. One to climb. One to act as a decoy. Then swap them while the defenders panic. Sometimes it works. Most times, you still fall into a ditch and spend the rest of the night arguing with a frog. But it's a tactic. And in medieval warfare, a tactic that doesn't immediately kill you is considered a good one. Now, before you nod off completely, here's a calming reminder to subscribe and like if this content is lulling you gently into slumber or existential dread. Leave a comment letting me know how long you lasted before dozing off and whether your dreams now include flaming ladders and monks with buckets of doom. Because next time, yes, there's a next time, we'll look at siege ladder sabotage, including how defenders booby-trapped their own walls, how ladders were made to fall apart mid-climb, and why one siege ended because someone climbed the wrong wall entirely. But for now, rest. You've earned it. Sleep well, brave ladder bearer. You wake up again. This time, it's not because of the cold, or the rats, or the guy next to you screaming because he dreamed about his ex and also maybe the plague. No, this time you wake up because someone is whispering very loudly in your ear. They booby-trap the walls. You blink. It's still dark, still damp, still smells like someone burned a cabbage inside a leather shoe. You're not sure if you ever really slept, but the whisper repeats. The ladders, they didn't fall. The walls did. Right. You sit up. You're in what can generously be described as camp, less a fortified base and more a cluster of damp tents arranged like drunken dominoes. Your armor is on the ground, covered in dew and disappointment. A chicken is pecking at your helmet. No one owns the chicken. And yet, your brain hooks on that phrase, they booby-trap the walls. Which is absolutely something that happened in medieval warfare, because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that when humans run out of clean water and basic dignity, they invent increasingly elaborate ways to ruin each other's day. Especially with ladders. So today, you're going to learn about siege ladder sabotage, because climbing the wall wasn't awful enough already. Now the wall is trying to kill you too. Let's begin with a mental image. You're halfway up a siege ladder. It's just after dawn. You haven't eaten anything except dried turnip and fear. The sky is gray. The fortress wall looms above you, black with soot and covered in the residue of last night's flaming tar welcome party. Your fingers grip a rung. Your feet shake on the one below. And then, click. The top of the wall tilts forward. Just a little. That's all the warning you get. Suddenly, 30 stone blocks come loose. A massive wooden platform, rigged on a hinge, swings down, smashing into your ladder and flinging your entire squad like wet laundry. You land on a pile of other failed optimists. Someone's boot is on your face. You don't know whose. It's probably not even from your army. This, dear listener, is called a trap parapet, a lovely little engineering feature where sections of the battlements are designed to fall forward or collapse inward, taking down any ladders and souls foolish enough to touch them. You might be thinking, that sounds complicated. And you'd be right. But medieval defenders had time. Siege warfare was slow. Like, glacially slow. Like, you've been outside this wall for 6 months and you've forgotten what bread tastes like slow. So while you were digging latrines and slowly becoming one with your fleas, the defenders were using carpenters, pulleys, and a deeply vindictive imagination to prepare your welcome mat. And this was only the beginning. Let's explore ladder-specific countermeasures, because yes, people built entire systems just to ruin the day of someone climbing a wooden stick. One favorite? Greased walls. No, really. Some fortresses, especially in Eastern Europe and parts of Italy, used rendered fat, fish oil, or even soap-like mixtures to coat sections of the outer wall. The idea wasn't just to make ladders slip, it was to make you slip. There you are, halfway up, clinging to a rung with 3 fingers and a prayer, when suddenly your boot slides off a polished, grease-slick stone. Your ladder wobbles. You scream. Everyone screams. And then you're falling, in a spectacular pirouette of failure. And for extra cruelty, sometimes the walls were greased unevenly, so it would look normal at first. Lull you into false confidence. Let you get just high enough that the fall will really hurt. It's not personal. It's medieval. Now, maybe you're thinking, fine. That's the walls. But the ladder itself, at least that's safe, right? No, it is not. Because the defenders have a ladder plan too. Specifically, counterladders. These are long, horizontal poles, sometimes sharpened, sometimes hooked, designed to push, pull, or straight up karate chop your ladder out from under you. You be halfway up, holding on for dear life, when suddenly a hole in the wall opens and a giant stick shoots out like a cursed piñata bat, knocking your ladder clean off the wall and launching you back into your father issues. Some were mounted on rotating turrets. Others had ropes to reset and swing again. And then, because humans are evil and creative, some defenders dipped their anti-ladder poles in tar and set them on fire. Picture it, you're climbing a ladder and a flaming log the size of a small tree comes swinging out of a murder hole and smashes you off like you're an aggressive wasp. Except wasps don't scream and soil themselves midair. If that sounds excessive, remember, the defenders were terrified too. Because if even one person made it over the wall with a sword and a bad attitude, the whole city could fall. So they didn't mess around. Sometimes, they sabotaged the climbers themselves. Not directly, of course. That would require manners. Instead, they'd sabotage the ground. How? With hidden ditches. These were narrow, spike-filled pits disguised with straw, mud, or unlucky livestock. The ladder would go up, and the first person to climb it would find that the base wasn't actually on solid ground. It was over a hole, which means that the whole contraption would suddenly drop, tilt, or collapse sideways at just the wrong moment. You wouldn't even know what happened. 1 second, you're climbing into glory. The next, you're tangled in a net of human limbs and regret, lying in a ditch with a spear in your thigh and someone's elbow in your ear. Now, let's talk about one of the most absurd and strangely effective sabotage tactics. Detachable wall facades. Used mostly in highly fortified castles in France and the Holy Roman Empire, these were panels that looked like walls, but weren't. They were removable, slidable, fake. Climbers would ascend with glorious determination, reach the top, swing their arm over the parapet, and fall straight through a cleverly disguised drop shaft. Imagine designing your wall with built-in false ledges just to ruin one guy's morning. That's the kind of energy we aspire to. But we're not done. Because sometimes defenders would sabotage your own ladders. Yes, They'd wait until you dropped or abandoned one, then steal it, modify it, and leave it back out during the next assault. Subtle changes. A rung loosened. A nail removed. One leg shortened. You climb it. You feel good. You think, finally, a ladder that doesn't smell like fermented goat. And then halfway up, crack. The whole thing folds like a paper crane, and you're kissing dirt with your mouth wide open. Trust no one. Especially not ladders. Now pause. Breathe. Stretch those imaginary limbs. Let's pivot briefly, because it's late and your brain is melting, to a soothing anecdote. The year is 1267. The location, Béziers in southern France. A town under siege. The attackers tried for weeks to climb the walls. But every ladder failed. Every climb was a disaster. It became a running joke among the defenders. They even named their favorite ladder, La Dame Tremblante, the Trembling Lady. Eventually, they invited a truce. Both sides met, and the commander of the defenders reportedly brought out the broken ladder, put it on a cart, and paraded it through the town square like a captured enemy. That's medieval humor. That's ladder trauma turned into performance art. Now, before you drift fully into dreamland, here's a gentle reminder. If you're still awake, and if this parade of wooden doom has not yet knocked you unconscious, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Leave a comment telling me your favorite sabotage tactic or your least favorite. And maybe let me know if you've ever fallen off a ladder in real life. You'll have more in common with a 13th century soldier than you think. As we close this chapter, remember, ladders were more than tools. They were tests, psychological gauntlets, bad decisions with foot rungs. And in the next chapter, we'll explore the politics of ladder duty, who got assigned to it, who avoided it, and how much coin you had to bribe someone to carry it for you. But for now, the fires are low. The stars are out. The ladder is splintered and silent. And you, lucky sleeper, are still in one piece. Sleep tight. You wake up in a field. No walls. No ladders. No screaming. No tar. Just dew-drenched grass and a suspicious number of flies circling your boots. There's a mild smell of horse sweat and burned onions. Your tongue feels like it was used as a whetstone. And your helmet is missing. Again. Welcome back to the siege. Except this time, you're not climbing the ladder. You're carrying it. And now we begin our descent into one of the least appreciated, but most deeply cursed, aspects of medieval siege warfare, ladder duty politics. Because someone had to carry those big splintery death sticks up to the wall, plant them, hold them steady while others climbed, and then maybe scramble up themselves, if they were still alive and hadn't been lit on fire. And surprise that someone was usually you. Or someone like you. Meaning, low-ranking, barely trained, frequently drunk, occasionally expendable. Possibly conscripted. Definitely unpaid. Probably suffering from a mild case of ringworm and a strong case of existential dread. See, in most medieval armies, there were two kinds of soldiers, the kind who owned a horse and the kind who carried things for the guy who owned a horse. You, tragically, are the second kind. So congratulations, you're on ladder detail. So let's break this down. First of all, you didn't volunteer. No one ever volunteered for ladder duty. This was not a glory position. This was not the kind of job you bragged about in the alehouse. This was the job you got because you mouthed off to your captain. You were slow to line up for food. You're from a village no one can pronounce. Or you simply weren't rich enough to afford armor that actually fit your body. See, the rich mites, the ones with polished steel, flowing capes, and horses that ate better than you. They weren't climbing ladders. They were sitting behind siege towers, sipping spiced wine, and waiting to charge dramatically through a breach gate. Maybe even rehearsing their heroic speech for later. But you had a 12-foot pine death pole and a very short life expectancy. Now, just to make sure you're fully immersed, imagine holding a siege ladder. It's heavier than it looks. The wood is rough. Splinters dig into your palms. It smells like moldy bark and old sweat. You're running, sprinting, across an open killing field. Arrows are flying. Rocks are being hurled. Someone to your left just got hit in the shoulder and is screaming in Latin, which is unsettling because no one here actually speaks Latin. You plant the ladder at the base of the wall. It hits the stone with a thunk that echoes deep in your spine. And then, you wait. You wait for someone to climb. Or you climb yourself. Or the defenders pour boiling water down, and you scream and let go, and the ladder topples backward like a drunk uncle at a wedding. It is, and this is not hyperbole, the worst possible job on the medieval battlefield. But that didn't stop armies from making it worse. Because now we enter the glorious world of ladder crew hierarchy. Yes, even in this flaming hellscape of poor life choices and constant death, there was a system. Generally speaking, siege armies organized ladder crews into three types. The carriers, poor bastards who lugged the ladders across open terrain. Often farmers or conscripts. Sometimes tied to the ladder to make sure they didn't run away. Yes, tied. Because nothing says loyalty like being physically attached to a piece of doomed furniture. The climbers, slightly higher status. Often lightly armored infantry. These were the guys who got first dibs on falling off. Some of them were professionals. Some were volunteers, which in medieval terms often meant blackmailed, bribed, or high on something pungent and homemade. The pushers, a rare breed. Their job was to brace the ladder at the bottom. Hold it steady. Make sure it didn't tip. Sometimes this meant standing directly beneath the ladder while flaming pitch, rocks, and sarcasm rained down on them. Many wore helmets. Few wore hope. In theory, you could move up this tragic ladder of social laddering. If you survived 5 assaults, you might be promoted from carrier to climber. If you climbed successfully and murdered someone at the top, you might be promoted to guy who sharpens spears in the back and never sees daylight again. A win, honestly. But the politics of ladder duty weren't just about status. They were about who controlled your fate. You see, every siege had a commander. And every commander had favorites. You know, his cousin from Lyon. That one guy who gave him a fancy dagger last Christmas. The knight with the singing voice. And those favorites? They got the good jobs. Siege tower positions. Archery squads. Even cooking duty. Meanwhile, you, poor, splinter-filled you, were dragging wood in the mud, bleeding from the ankles, and trying not to get stabbed by both the enemy and your own friend for taking the last piece of hardtack. And don't even get me started on the mercenaries. Yes. Some sieges used hired muscle, foreigners, professionals, men with names like Gerald the Mangler and that guy who smells like death. And these guys? They never touched a ladder, because they charged extra for anything involving personal risk. And ladder duty was maximum risk with minimum pay. It was the medieval equivalent of being the red shirt in Star Trek. First on the battlefield. First to die. First to be forgotten. So instead, mercenaries were often used after the wall was breached, or during the plundering, or just standing around looking terrifying and well-fed, while you, sweet, tragic you, were out front holding the thing that got people killed. Now, just for fun, let's talk bribes. Because yes, in some armies, you could bribe your way off ladder duty. You could pay someone else, usually a desperate rookie or a criminal trying to earn a pardon, to take your place. It might cost you coin, or food, or, in one weird case from the siege of Zara in 1202, a love letter to someone's cousin, which may have been a euphemism. We don't ask. Of course, bribes didn't guarantee safety, because commanders were petty. If they didn't like your face or your accent or the way you chewed, you could still be assigned to special ladder detail, which meant you'd carry the extra tall ladder alone uphill into a headwind while everyone else watched and quietly judged your posture. Still awake? Good. Let's drift now into the psychology of being a ladder soldier. It messes with your head. You know you're expendable. You see the guys with better armor standing behind you. You hear them joke about your odds. You smell their stew. You imagine their toes are dry. You, meanwhile, haven't had a dry toe since Lent. So you develop coping mechanisms. Some soldiers got superstitious. They'd whisper to their ladders. Name them. Carve little charms into the wood. One popular one? A tiny engraving of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Which is, frankly, perfect. Others developed fatalistic humor. There are recorded songs, sung by ladder carriers, with lyrics like, "Up I go, up I fall. Hope there's beer beyond the wall." And, "Climb the wood, die like men. If not today, then try again." Yes, that was real. Morbid comedy was the only armor some people had. Still others simply disassociated, went numb, treated the whole experience like a bad dream they were just waiting to wake up from. You can almost imagine them at the foot of the ladder, staring up at the sky and thinking, maybe next time I'll be a baker. Of course, if you were lucky, very lucky, you might be reassigned. To what? Oh, something nice. Like latrine duty. Yes. Literally shoveling other people's filth was considered an upgrade from ladder crew. Perspective. As we drift toward the end of this chapter, let's recap your day. You woke up covered in ants. You carried a ladder that smelled like mildew and cowardice. You planted it against a wall that hated you. You watched a guy fall off it, catch fire, and then shout something heroic before he exploded. And now you're in your tent, drinking cold broth from a boot, and hoping no one remembers your name tomorrow. Welcome to ladder politics. Welcome to war. And as you, dear listener, lie in your much more comfortable bed, remember this: somewhere, somehow, a ladder soldier still haunts the echoes of forgotten battlefields, splintered, smelly, and slightly bitter about the whole glory thing. In the next chapter, we'll look at ladder innovations. Yes, people actually redesigned these things for maximum efficiency, portability, and dramatic failure. But for now, breathe. Rest. Let the weight of the wood slide from your shoulders. Your ladder shift is over, for now. You wake up. Again. But this time, it's not to the smell of rotting barley or your tent mate's foot breath. No. Today you wake up next to a pile of rope and pulleys, and wooden pegs, and something that looks vaguely like a cart, but has no wheels and screams, "I was built by an enthusiastic carpenter with a death wish." Why? Because congratulations, you're now part of the Siege Ladder Innovation Team. Yes, there was one. Because nothing says military advancement like taking an extremely flawed piece of climbing equipment and deciding, you know what would make this better? More mechanical failure. So today, we're digging into the absolutely unhinged, historically accurate, and occasionally hilarious world of ladder engineering during medieval warfare. You didn't think they just stopped at stick with rungs, did you? Oh no. Because the medieval mind, when not consumed by plague, famine, and arguments over whether God cared about fish on Fridays, was weirdly obsessed with tweaking things that already mostly worked. So instead of solving hunger or inventing indoor plumbing, military engineers, yes, that was a real job, spent centuries reinventing the ladder. Some called them scaling devices. Others called them siege escalades or assault platforms. Most people just called them nope. Let's start simple. The first innovation was the hooked ladder. Very clever. The top had little iron hooks to grip the battlement or catch on the crenellations. That's the fancy term for those square cutouts on top of castle walls, the ones your enemies shoot arrows through and your feet will never reach. These hooks were supposed to help the ladder stay on the wall instead of sliding off like a terrified eel on a rain-slick rock. Which would have been great if castle walls weren't also lined with anti-ladder countermeasures. Like what? Let's see. Rows of grease stone, seriously. Jagged masonry lips called brattices to block ladders. And in some places, literal cow dung smeared on the lower wall to make climbing even more horrific. And yes, some had that job. Now, if hooks didn't do the trick, maybe you'd prefer something a bit more dramatic. Enter the folding assault ladder. Picture this, a big, heavy ladder. But it folds in half. Why? So you can carry it closer to the wall without it poking the back of your commanding officer's neck. Then, once you're close enough, bam, you unfold it, like a deadly picnic table, and up you go. Or, you would, except the mechanism often jammed, or folded the wrong way, or didn't lock properly, causing the ladder to collapse like a disappointed father during your 5th grade violin recital. Many soldiers died not from arrows or boiling oil, but from engineering optimism. Still, the inventors pressed on. Because someone had a notebook full of drawings and very strong feelings about wooden physics. This led to one of the more truly deranged creations, the rolling ladder tower. Now, to be clear, this is not a siege tower. Siege towers were big, boxy, slow-moving wooden fortresses on wheels, covered in hides and filled with angry men with spears and zero bladder control. No, rolling ladder towers were compact, unstable, and terrifying. They looked like wheelbarrows married to ladders. Usually pushed by about 4 very nervous men. These things rolled up to the walls, braked awkwardly, and tilted the ladder forward to bridge the gap. Unfortunately, the gap often included a moat, which is how one enthusiastic knight, in the 13th century siege of Toulouse, launched himself into a dry moat full of thorns while shouting for victory. Victory did not happen, but pain did. Now, if you thought rolling was bad, let's talk about rope ladders. Yes, rope. Flexible, portable, lightweight. Absolutely terrible. You'd think they'd be ideal. They could be coiled, carried, thrown, even smuggled inside pastries if you were creative enough. But rope ladders had a fatal flaw: physics. Try climbing one while wearing 30 pounds of armor and carrying a sword, while someone above you is pouring gravel down your face. You'll spin. You'll sway. You'll cry. Rope ladders are only fun if you're an acrobat or a lunatic. And in medieval war, those two were basically the same thing. Now, not all ladder innovations were total disasters. Some were just half disasters. Take the double-width ladder. Twice as wide. 2 soldiers could climb side by side. The theory? Speed. More troops, faster assault, more pressure on the defenders. The result? Well, it turns out when 2 soldiers try to climb side by side during a battle, what you actually get is twice the screaming and half the balance. In one siege in 1349, a double-width ladder was used by French troops to storm an English-held keep. 4 soldiers climbed it. 2 slipped. One accidentally stabbed the other in the thigh. The last one made it to the top, only to be immediately yeeted off by a man with a frying pan. So, mixed results. But the true high point or low point, depending on your worldview, came with the counterweight ladder crane. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. An actual crane, built near the siege line, used to lower a ladder from above. The crane would swing the ladder out over a moat or trench and delicately place it against the enemy wall, like some kind of war-themed claw machine. Now, in theory, this kept your soldiers safer. In practice, the wind moved the ladder mid-drop. The rope snapped from weight. The crane operator got distracted. Or, and this is the best one, the defenders set the ladder on fire while it was still dangling. There's something deeply tragic about watching a flaming ladder slowly rotate in midair while 5 guys scream, "Should we still climb?" And yet, they tried again. And again. Because innovation in medieval warfare was less about does it work and more about what else can we strap to this terrible idea. So now we come to one of the weirdest concepts ever drafted in the dusty scrolls of castle warfare, the human ladder. Yes, a ladder made of humans. Picture this: one soldier climbs onto another soldier's back. Another follows. They stack. They reach. No actual wood involved. It was used sparingly, in desperate situations, usually when ladders were destroyed, broken, or forgot to be ordered. The idea was to form a living chain, with the strongest men at the bottom and the most nimble at the top. Spoiler, this never went well. Most human ladders collapsed after the 3rd or 4th soldier, usually with a chorus of muffled swearing and at least one guy yelling, "I told you this wouldn't work." And if you're wondering how they practiced, they didn't. They just did it once. And then never again. Smart. But of course, not all ladder innovations came from the attackers. Some came from the defenders. Because if you're living behind the wall and you see a ladder coming up, you have options. You can push it back. You can cut the rungs. You can set it on fire. Or, if you're really clever, you can booby-trap your own wall. Some castles had false ledges, flat surfaces designed to collapse under the weight of a soldier who just reached the top. Others had hidden oil grooves, channels built into the stone, letting defenders pour oil into the ladder frame without exposing themselves. And in the Siege of Lisbon, defenders allegedly dropped a giant beehive onto a climbing squad. This was never formally documented by science. But beekeepers everywhere nodded in approval. So where does all this leave you? In a tent, again. Surrounded by schematics drawn in charcoal on parchment, listening to some overly excited engineer explain how this time the pulley system will definitely hold 3 men at once and maybe a donkey if the wind isn't too strong. You nod politely. You sip stale beer. And you quietly wonder what your life would have been like if you'd gone into sheep farming instead. As your eyes drift closed, you imagine a world with no siege ladders. Just you, a field, some sheep, and no one shouting for the king while they fall headfirst into a moat. Sleep well, innovator. Your ladder prototype can wait until morning. You wake up, but not in your tent. Not this time. You wake up on your back, staring at the undercarriage of a wooden plank. It's groaning slightly in the wind, swaying just above your face. You've been here for a while, long enough to realize you're not dead, but you're certainly reconsidering a few decisions. You're on a siege ladder, but not climbing it. No, you've already climbed it. You're on the top rung, waiting for the soldier in front of you to get over the wall. He's screaming. Everyone is screaming. Because now we're in the thick of it. We've done the theories, the design flaws, the grotesque engineering ambitions of men who should never have been handed wood and nails. And now we're deep in the actual chaos of medieval siege combat. This chapter isn't about building ladders. It's about using them. And spoiler alert, it sucks. You're not storming a wall because you believe in justice, honor, or kingdom. You're here because your commander said, take the wall or die, and those were the only two options. So here you are, pressed like a sardine in chainmail between the guy below you who definitely just wet himself and the guy above you who has a crossbow bolt in his thigh but insists he's fine. He's not. The ladder creaks. You do not feel fine. And you're about to find out why actually climbing a siege ladder during a medieval assault was one of the worst things you could do with your life. First of all, let's talk weight. Because you're not climbing this ladder in gym shorts and sneakers. You're in full gear, 35 pounds of chainmail or plate, a helmet that limits your vision to a funnel of dread, and boots slick with blood, mud, and someone's breakfast. Your sword is slapping your thigh. Your shield is smacking the guy below you. And you're trying to get footing on thin wooden rungs that were hammered together by someone whose carpentry experience involved mostly prayer. You're already exhausted, and you haven't even reached the wall. Now, the defenders? They're thrilled you're coming. Because they've been waiting for this moment all day. You're an easy target. Your ascent is slow. You can't move left or right. You are, in many ways, the perfect human piñata. And they have options. Let's go down the list. Rocks. Large ones. Smooth or jagged. Dropped or thrown directly on your head. Hot oil. Yes, that's real. But it wasn't boiling oil from your kitchen pantry. More likely, it was hot sand, molten pitch, or heated animal fat, all of which cause horrifying burns, and all of which will seep through your armor and ruin your day. Spears. Poke downward. The medieval equivalent of stabbing someone through a staircase banister. Arrows. Fired point blank into your face from behind the battlements while you're halfway up and totally exposed. Dead animals. Not even joking. Corpses were hurled from above to knock climbers down. Sometimes cows. Sometimes pigs. Sometimes, parts of neighbors. You know, for morale. And then there's the real fun, burning the ladder. Yes, if the defenders had a moment of peace and a few good torches, they would happily set your only means of upward mobility on fire. So imagine, you're 15 feet in the air, clinging to a plank of rapidly warming wood. The guy below you is screaming. The guy above you is screaming. You're screaming. But none of you can move. Because that's the key detail people forget about siege ladders, they're bottlenecks. Only one person at a time can crest the top. Which means if the person above you dies, freezes, or gets dismembered in a way that blocks progress, the entire ladder is now a vertical queue of doom. And if someone falls, you all fall. This isn't a modern climbing wall with safety harnesses and soft mats. It's a shaky, blood-stained, fire-prone death stick leaning against a stone wall designed specifically to repel you. So let's imagine you make it to the top. Congratulations. You're alive. You get 1/2 second to breathe. Then it's over the wall. And what do you find? A narrow walkway. Possibly greased. Probably spiked. Filled with people trying to kill you with swords, axes, and pure panic. You try to get your footing, but you're disoriented. The drop behind you is sudden. The space is tight. There's shouting, smoke, chaos, and you're one of maybe 5 people who made it up so far. You know what the defenders have? More men. Better footing. A psychological advantage. And in some cases, boiling sewage. Because why waste water? You lunge forward, swing your sword, maybe kill someone. But even if you do, even if you clear the wall, you now have to hold it. Which is hilariously impossible unless reinforcements get up the ladder immediately. But remember, the ladder is blocked by at least 3 corpses, some broken equipment, and a goat someone brought for morale. So you retreat, or fall, or die. And the next person climbs up, thinking maybe they'll be the one who succeeds. They won't. Because siege ladder assaults were rarely about actually getting over the wall. They were about distraction. That's a secret most people don't tell you. Ladders weren't the main event. They were the sideshow. While your friends got turned into medieval pancakes on the planks, a battering ram or sapper team was probably working on the gate, or digging under the walls, or lighting fire to the base of the tower. And your screaming assent? It was a diversion. You were the sacrifice. A meat ladder. An armored maypole of suffering. That's not to say no one ever succeeded. They did, rarely. At the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders famously scaled the walls and took the city. But only after weeks of preparation, multiple failed assaults, and some enthusiastic divine justification. At the siege of Rochester in 1215, rebels were driven back down the ladders again and again, until the king tunneled under the keep and set pig fat on fire to collapse the foundation. So, not exactly a ladder success story. But even in failure, the ladder climbers served a purpose. They wore down the defenders. They soaked up arrows. They drew manpower away from more serious breaches. You weren't expected to win. You were expected to try. That was medieval warfare, bleak, messy, mathematically unfair. And ladder assaults were the distilled version of that hopelessness. A mun, a stick, a wall, a few seconds to make history, or die anonymously in a ditch. Now, back to you. You're lying flat on your back again. This time, you're not on a ladder. You're in a stretcher. Someone is dragging you away from the wall while muttering, "You're lucky, lad. Could have been worse. Could have been the guy who brought the ladder." And as you fade in and out of consciousness, smelling blood, smoke, and what may or may not be burning manure, you realize something. The ladder never had a chance. And neither did you. Sleep, soldier. There's another ladder tomorrow. You wake up. Somehow, again. This time in what might be a medical tent, or a slightly organized pile of cloth with a dead guy in the corner and a bucket labeled leech storage. The good news, you're not bleeding anymore. The bad news, you might be missing a toe. And your ears are ringing, not from battle, but from the sound of yet another siege ladder debriefing. You groan. Because it's happening again. They're planning another assault. And guess what? You've been voluntold for the next wave. But this chapter isn't about your direct suffering on the ladder. Not exactly. This one's about the people who sent you up there. The minds behind the madness. The medieval generals, engineers, and self-proclaimed tacticians who said, yes, absolutely. Let's send 200 men up a ladder into open arrow fire. Sounds perfect. So buckle in. We're digging into ladder strategy and the fine medieval art of throwing men at walls and hoping math doesn't notice. Let's start with the basics. When did people decide ladders were a war tactic? Basically, the moment someone built a wall. In the ancient world, walls kept bad things out and also trapped you in with your own bad ideas. Mesopotamians used ladders in siege warfare over 4,000 years ago. Egyptian reliefs show soldiers climbing up wooden ladders toward fortress walls while being pelted with flaming debris and divine indifference. But it was the Greeks and Romans who really started getting scientific about it. See, in the Roman world, everything had a chart. A flow chart, probably. Does the city have walls? Yes, bring ladders. Roman military manuals, and there were many, had detailed sections on ladder dimensions, carrying angles, soldier spacing, and ideal ascent rhythms. Because nothing screams logistics genius like organizing a human wave of death up a stick. Fast forward to the Middle Ages and suddenly everyone is using them, from peasant revolts to imperial armies, because ladders were cheap, portable, and required absolutely no deep thought to use. Which is exactly why everyone with deep thoughts hated them. Let's imagine the scene. You're a commander. You've got 3,000 troops, half of whom are hungover, lice-ridden, and slightly allergic to wood splinters. You've got some ladders. About 50 of them. Each one was built by your cousin's drunk carpenter friend who got paid in radishes. Now, you could wait for your siege engines to break the gate. You could tunnel under the wall. You could even try starving them out. But you don't have time. The winter's coming. Your men are already muttering about eating the horses. And someone just stole the camp's last wine flask. So instead, you shout, "Send the ladders." And immediately, The plan becomes, get men close enough to the wall without all of them dying, put the ladders up, send them over, and somehow not get slaughtered in the most embarrassing way possible. This is where strategy tries to exist. First step, cover fire. Archers and crossbowmen are positioned to fire at the battlements, to keep defenders ducking while the ladder troops run up. In theory, this works. In practice, most defenders just duck and then stab you anyway. Second step, staggered waves. You send a few squads at a time, so if one gets wiped out, at least the others learn from their mistakes. The learning curve is very short and mostly involves screaming. Third step, decoy attacks. This is where ladder teams truly shine. They're often not meant to win. They're just meant to die loudly enough that the enemy focuses on them while your real breach team tunnels under the wall or brings up the battering ram. You're not the hero of the story. You're the smoke grenade. Congratulations. Now, let's talk about placement. You don't just put the ladder anywhere. No, that would be logical. Instead, commanders argued endlessly over where on the wall to place ladders. Corners? Too narrow. Middle? Too exposed. Near a tower? Risky but possibly successful if you can eliminate the archer inside with a very lucky javelin throw and a prayer to at least 2 saints. Ladder teams were sometimes coordinated by horn, bell, or colored flags. A green flag meant advance. A red flag meant fall back. A black flag meant we forgot the plan and everything is now on fire. If you're the unlucky soul holding the flag, you're also the easiest to shoot. Just FYI. Now, here's where things get extra spicy. Sometimes ladder teams were given incentives. We're talking promises of land, extra food, a slightly bigger tent, the favor of a noble lady, real or imagined. Or, the classic, you'll be remembered as a hero. This was a lie. You won't be remembered. You'll be flattened, stepped on, and buried in a ditch labeled miscellaneous. But maybe, your squad gets over the wall. And that's when the real strategy begins, securing a foothold. See, getting up is hard. But staying up? That's a completely new nightmare. Commanders knew that sending one ladder wasn't enough. You needed to send 10, maybe 20, all in rapid succession, so that even if the first 4 were smashed, the 5th one might get 5 guys over. 5 guys might hold the wall for 30 seconds. Then 5 more arrive. And now you've got a beachhead. A tiny, bloody, slippery section, a stone wall. Your victory depends on holding it for longer than it takes the defenders to scream for reinforcements. That's when backup archers are supposed to shoot anyone coming to dislodge you. Meanwhile, other troops try to expand the breach. Maybe you light a tower on fire. Maybe you open the gate from inside. Maybe you get stabbed by a 12-year-old squire with a butter knife and a personal vendetta. All is fair in siege warfare. Some commanders took things to extremes. At the siege of Chateau Gallard in 1203, French troops used ladders to climb the toilet chute, yes, the actual sewage pipe, of a corner tower, sneaking inside the castle in the most literal expression of backdoor entry imaginable. It worked. But at what cost? Another classic tactic was ladder flanking. While the main force made a show of attacking the front gate, small elite units used ladders to scale a less defended wall section under cover of darkness. Of course, darkness doesn't stop you from falling off the ladder, or from being spotted by a guard who didn't get the no overtime memo. Now, in terms of equipment coordination, siege ladder teams needed runners to carry spare ladders, ropes, or messages, shield bearers to guard climbers from arrows, sappers, who sometimes dug under the wall while you distracted the defenders, and occasionally, priests, who were there to bless the whole operation and maybe pray your broken ankle heals before winter. Because nothing says faith like being asked to carry a 200-pound ladder into certain death while being sprinkled with holy water. Some commanders tried to modernize things. In the late medieval period, attempts were made to combine ladders and siege towers, creating tall, mobile structures that dropped ladders from above. These were elaborate, costly, and about as reliable as medieval dental surgery. They looked great on paper. And then the wind blew, and the entire structure tipped over onto a pigsty, killing 4 men and 1 very confused pig. So the humble ladder endured. Not because it was good, but because it was always available. And when you're out of money, out of time, and out of sane options, nothing beats the terrifying efficiency of telling your soldiers, here's a wooden stick. Good luck storming the wall. Now, as for you, you're back on the roster. The next assault begins at dawn. You're staring at a new ladder, freshly built, still dripping with sap and misplaced confidence. The same height, the same flaws. But this time, maybe you'll make it to the top. You probably won't. But hope springs eternal. And ladder assaults, like bad ideas and questionable stew, are always on the menu. Rest well, soldier. The horn blows at sunrise.